the dove particle, Human Nature and American Politics. It is a fixture in the historical and scholarly and introductory literature to hold philosopher Thomas Hobbes to the view that people are terrible creatures. We are reminded time and again that Hobbes's state of nature, quote unquote, ensures a reality that is, in his words, nasty, brutish, and short. This, of course, is not what Hobbes means in his masterwork Leviathan. One grows weary of seeing the same quotes over and over again, like Adam Smith's invisible hand. These quotes end up distorting the thinker's actual arguments. Hobbes observes that when you go to bed at night, you close your doors and lock them. Is this a reflection of your personal philosophy of human nature? Hardly. Nevertheless, Hobbes does draw humans mechanically as physicalistic beings. A number of thinkers during the Enlightenment sought to put a smiley face on Hobbes's mechanical human. Two early Enlightenment thinkers, Anthony Ashley Cooper, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, and Bishop Joseph Butler, set up what would become known as moral sense theory. Shaftesbury observes, and these are his words, "Because a sense of right and wrong is as natural to us as natural affection itself, and is a first principle in our makeup, there is no theory, opinion, persuasion, or belief that can immediately or directly exclude or destroy it." End of quote. Butler, in his sermons at Rolls Chapel in London, makes a similar case using similar language. This is Butler. "There is a principle of reflection in men by which they distinguish between approve and disapprove their own actions. This principle in man by which he approves or disapproves his heart, temper, and actions is conscience, and that this faculty tends to restrain men from doing mischief to each other and leads them to do good. It is too manifest to need being insisted upon." End of quote. We possess an internal native sense of right and wrong and tend toward the former. This is not to suggest that people are angels, just that we are moral beings. We make moral judgments and use moral language, even the worst among us. Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau took the position that humans are motivated by pity. Rousseau says, these are Rousseau's words, "Pity is what, in the state of nature, takes the place of laws, mores, and virtue, with the advantage that no one is tempted to disobey its sweet voice. Pity is what will prevent every robust savage from robbing a weak child or an infirm old man of his hard-earned subsistence, and if he himself expects to be able to find his own someplace else." Yes, people do vicious things, but most of us do not. Rousseau maintains that we would be little more than monsters without this pity in our nature. We would live in the hell that so many attribute to Hobbes. We would tear one another limb from limb with nary a thought given to our behavior. Prominent Scottish Enlightenment figure David Hume challenged the history of philosophy's position that moral judgments are the product of reason. Hume famously stated that morality is more properly felt than judged of. Hume makes the case that morality is more a neck down proposition than a neck up one. Our sense of right and wrong is just that. It's a sense, a feeling. Hume had a profound influence on friend Adam Smith, another key Scottish Enlightenment figure. In his theory of moral sentiments, Smith lays out a more developed moral philosophy than Hume's. one that recently seems to be garnering greater attention. Smith and Hume were certainly simpatico philosophically, and Smith, too, bases his moral philosophy on feeling or sentiment. The first sentence in Moral Sentiments, that's Smith's major text in moral philosophy, goes as follows: "How selfish soever man may be supposed," which is kind of a shot at Hobbes, "there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." End of quote. Smith sketches the moral conscience. Like Hume, he offers a neck-down hypothesis. He says that we desire naturally to be loved and to be lovely. That is, to be deserving of that love. One sees this all over the world if one is only willing to look. I have had the good fortune to travel internationally, and it's hard to miss. Most people want the same things: to love their children, to seek to get along with their neighbors, to see their streets devoid of foreign tanks, and so on. Yes, some people abuse their children, make for awful neighbors, and support military aggression. But the language is hard to miss. Those who support military aggression and abuse their children tend to use a moral vocabulary. Tyrants and war criminals use it. When the United States rained death and destruction on Vietnam, policy planners employed moral-sounding justifications. Americans were told that the United States was doing wonderful things in Southeast Asia. Likewise, in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 21st century. Naturally, it's virtuous if we do it. We at worst make mistakes. The Chinese and the Russians don't make mistakes. What they do is the work of the devil himself, even if they're doing the same things that we do. However, most people do not behave this way. War criminals are rare. Child abusers are rare. Rousseau's point about monsters obtains. If we were without pity, without sympathy, the world would be an absolute nightmare. Poor behavior, unfortunately, receives the preponderance of attention in the press. As they say, if it bleeds, it leads. But should our view of humanity be defined by CNN? The world of 20th and 21st century science has repeatedly substantiated the work done during the Enlightenment. Primatologists, anthropologists, neuroscientists, and psychologists time and again reference Hume and Smith in their books. Primatologist Franz de Waal has looked closely at mainly chimpanzees and bonobos and has noted the building blocks of our morality on display. De Waal notes that the animal kingdom is not as dog-eat-dog as we have been told it is. This characterization is not fair to dogs either, it should be added. The closer we look at animals in general, the smarter they get, and the more order we see. Where scientists saw little else but chaos in the jungle less than a century ago, we now see a relatively impressive amount of order and cooperation. This is not to suggest that chimps don't fight. But when it's a relation or a friend, they don't go full throttle in the brawl, like you might get into it with one of your siblings. You don't go full throttle. There's something in your brain that just tells you to go a quarter throttle when you get into a fist fight with your sister or your brother. You don't fight your sister or your brother like you found someone in your kitchen with a ski mask at 3 o'clock in the morning, okay? That's a different fight. I highly recommend de Waal's book, The Bonobo and the Atheist. He focuses also on conflict resolution. There's a tremendous amount of order and and cooperation in these groups, in chimp groups and bonobo groups. And he's got a TED Talk on YouTube, which I highly recommend. Developmental psychologist Paul Bloom at Yale is conducting fascinating research on babies and toddlers. Though this sounds sinister, Bloom and his wife and colleague Karen Wynn conduct what amount to puppet shows for their diminutive subjects. And gauge the attention an infant will pay to a particular puppet. These looking time tests indicate the infant's interest in a specific character. And time and again, babies show a preference for stuffed animals that behave well over those that behave badly. As Bloom summarizes in his book, Just Babies, this is Bloom, the experiments suggest that babies have a general appreciation of good and bad behavior. Now, we certainly haven't proven that the understanding that guides the baby's choices actually counts as moral, but the baby responses do have certain signature properties of adult moral judgments. Bloom also says, we are finding in babies what philosophers in the Scottish Enlightenment described as a moral sense. End of quote. Bloom quotes Hume and Smith throughout his book. Many, almost all, of the scientists I have looked at, Duvall, Bloom, philosopher Patricia Churchland, who focuses on neuroscience, social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, mention and applaud Hume and Smith in their books. When the books arrive from Amazon, I remove them from the box. I then experience guilt for having used Amazon. I turn to the book's index, and there they are. Hume and Smith are now, 250 years later, the talk of the town. Another instance of confirmation comes from anthropologist Christopher Bohm. Bohm suggests that it was 45,000 years ago that humans conducted a revolution, suppressed alpha male tendencies, and created a more horizontal distribution of power in foraging groups. Equitable meat sharing became the priority in the context of large game hunting. We are not sure what came first, the large game hunting or the change in group dynamic, but now alpha male greed would no longer be tolerated. Human forager groups, that is hunter-gatherers, became egalitarian. Over maybe 1,000 generations, a list of behavioral expectations entered the human genome. You will know this as your moral conscience. When you do something wrong, it bothers you. Scientific research has caught up to philosophy. In other words, we have not gone much further than Hume when it comes to major insights into the nature of humans. Perhaps Noam Chomsky's work on linguistics might be added to the story, that language is part of our genetic endowment. But as for our understanding of human morality, the Scottish Enlightenment represents the high water mark. We haven't gone much past the 18th century. We are a cooperative species that shares a universal moral core. There exists profound moral continuity across the globe. There is really very little moral disagreement in the world. I realize to some that sounds insane, but at the level of principle, there is broad species-wide agreement on a range of issues. It is at the level of value systems, which are cultural, where humans can get themselves into trouble. Because morality is biological, there tends to be similarity at the core. At the cultural surface, we see greater diversity. Our religions are also like this, virtually identical at the core, dramatically different at the surface. Likewise with our languages. At the grammatical core, it's hard to tell English, Arabic, Greek, and Russian apart. On the surface, those languages are quite different. How they sound, their lexicons, and how they look could not be more different. Our religions and languages bear a strong resemblance to us, basically the same on the inside, quite different at the surface. Like language and morality, culture is part of our biology. It is people, and not always people, imitating one another. Many animals do it too. When you pick up an idiosyncratic mannerism or turn of phrase from a friend or loved one, that is the transmission of one unit of culture. You now do that thing with your head while you talk, much like your mother does, which is one meme. And when someone points it out, you have no idea what the person's talking about. Though I suspect everyone in this room has caught themselves doing this, imitating a brother or your dad or a friend, like, oh my God, I'm doing that thing that so-and-so does, Everyone in this room has done this probably, 1,000 times. Humans transmit small things, like you and your mother doing that weird thing with your heads while you speak. And humans transmit enormous things as well. Extensive belief systems that influence people by the billions. Humans likely began as animists, viewing the forest as being inhabited with spirits and energies. And it was the tribal shaman or witch doctor who made contact with the spirit world, where dead things ostensibly went. The long-held assumption that it was that the humans underwent the agricultural revolution, transitioning from foraging to farming, and then built structures and places of worship. The immense 22-acre archaeological site, Göbekli Tepe, in Turkey indicates a completely different narrative, where foraging groups started with the structure. The best guess is that Göbekli Tepe, which is 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, was a temple, a place of worship built by foraging communities. Not far from Göbekli Tepe, some of the earliest domesticated wheat has been found. Probably not a coincidence. But it was the agricultural revolution that had perhaps the biggest influence on human religious orientation. For the first time, humans stayed put, cultivating crops on a farm. When people died, you buried them on the farm. And when more people died, you buried them on the farm. These burial grounds quickly got crowded. When foragers lost members of their group, they buried them wherever they happened to be and kept on moving. Not so with farmers. Now there was a cemetery. The farm, therefore, took on a spiritual significance. People began worshiping their ancestors, and not all ancestors were equal. The family patriarch or elder was paid greater reverence. These ancestors over time became high gods of immense power, some involved in human affairs. Fast forward thousands of years to approximately the time of Homer and Socrates, we see the emergence of Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Jainism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Judaism, Christianity, and later Islam. This all basically happened at the same time, and these major world faiths bear much in common, principally the golden rule. That is, I should not do to you what I don't want for myself. Humans seem to gravitate toward the spiritual. As paleoanthropologist Chris Stringer puts it, humans do seem to be pre-programmed for religious beliefs, plural. And historian Karen Armstrong takes the same position by saying, there is a case for arguing that Homo sapiens is also Homo religiosus. Every time I read that, it sounds like a Harry Potter spell. Every time. There are important political implications to this narrative. We are basically the same and are in greater moral agreement than not. it should stand to reason that we would want and need more or less the same things. If we consult the public opinion polls, we see quite striking agreement among Americans. The artificial red-blue liberal-conservative polarity disappears, and the true centrist liberal America emerges. And this point bears highlighting. The center of the political spectrum becomes the true center when we calibrate it to where most Americans stand on most issues most of the time. And when we consult the literature, we see that Americans are in agreement roughly to the tune of 2/3 on just about every major political issue. I have a list here of public opinion data of results, but I don't want to read them all because they might be tedious. But just know that they're here. If you want to see them after, that's fine. But it covers a really wide range from raising the minimum wage to raising taxes on people who make more than $1 million a year, to U.S.-Iran relations, to abortion, to gun laws, marijuana, you name it. And so if we take all these figures, I took the average of all these percentages, and they come to 67%. So that's the liberal center. Liberalism being a centrist political philosophy. When John Locke authored his second treatise of government, he didn't do it as a radical. And when Thomas Jefferson described Locke's work as perfect, it was likewise not as a radical. When the center is calibrated correctly, certain questions arise. Why is Congress to the right of the population? Why do Obama and both Clintons and Joe Biden define what liberal is? Why is Bernie Sanders labeled a leftist and despised by journals like the New York Times? Bernie Sanders does not have a leftist or socialist bone in his body. He is an FDR Democrat and little else. He can call himself a socialist in much the same way that I can call myself a matador. But labeling a thing a particular name does not make it so. If Obama and both Clintons and Joe Biden define the left edge of respectable opinion, what does this say about the population? Is it disreputable? Is it despised by the New York Times? Is it the case that what the population wants is radical and leftist and therefore is beyond the pale of legitimate political discourse? Thinkers during the Enlightenment redrew the human being. They took into account humanity's sense of pity and sense of sympathy. And for the first time, placed those feelings at the center of what we are. As David Hume said, it cannot be disputed that there is some benevolence, however small, infused into our bosom. Some spark of friendship for humankind, some particle of the dove kneaded into our frame. He does concede that the elements of the wolf and the serpent exist alongside it. But the elements of the wolf and the serpent do not define what we are. Modern science continues to verify what these thinkers had to say. They laid an important groundwork that researchers today are corroborating in test after test, in book after book. And this quickly becomes a political story, one I feel is worth telling, one that we would do well to bear in mind. We should be talking about politics. We should do it better than your uncles. We can dispense with the polarizing language of liberal and conservative, something I urge my students to do. And instead, begin the conversation with what you want. And you will find there is much room for agreement. You can have a productive conversation that will likely not degenerate into bickering and the hurling of ideological labels at one another. The Enlightenment has shown us how to proceed, and if we would like to see a United States, 50 of them, in 20 years, we might follow their lead. Thank you. I guess we'll open the floor for questions or comments. Don't be shy. Anything? Not many takers on the popcorn. Yeah, Zaker. Or Daker. Wrong consonant. It rhymes. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Daker.
So with all your research and everything that you've done and continue to do you think that in like the next 20 years that we'll be more divided as a country, or do you think that there's potential that we actually could come together?
There will be what in this country?
With all your research and everything that you've been doing and
Yeah.
continue, do you think in like the next 20 years that we'll be more divided as a country or actually come together?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, that question's a good one, and the question tells us a lot, I think. The nation is actually not divided. Americans agree on just about everything to a pretty healthy majoritarian, level or degree. At the polls, we're divided. Everything's down to the razor's edge. This is the land of 49%, as they say. So I think, to answer your question, it's up to you guys. I know that sounds like a non-answer, but it really is. It's up to people your age. It's up to Generation Z. Generation Z had a huge impact on the midterm elections we just saw. They had a huge impact on that, and you're going to continue to have a large impact. You can't count on the baby boomers in my generation. You can't. They've already made their terrible decisions, and they have tremendous nerve being critical of the millennials and you. They have their own track records to contend with if they want to look in the mirror and have a conversation and be critical of someone. They can just go do that in the mirror. It's up to you guys. It's up to the younger generations, the millennials and Generation Z, as to what the next 20 years of this country has in store. Okay, good. Yeah, Zaker.
Going off that, do you think that the political spectrum will shift more towards the center and maybe even the left with the new generations and how we're being raised?
I think it already is. I mean, the Democrats, I try to make this very clear in my ethics classes, but I mean, the Democrats are moving to the left, toward the center. That's crucial. You cannot neglect that second part. The Democrats are moving to the left. Yes, that's true. Toward the center, which all that means is that the Democrats are getting closer to what the majority wants. And they're starting to pay more attention to what the working class wants. The Republicans have been moving to the right for decades, moving away from working class priorities and away from the majority. And if they continue on that path, I truly don't know what kind of future the Republican Party has in this country. I don't. And I don't think they do either. I think, they act scared. The Republican Party is acting like a wounded animal, and it's sending all the signals that power sends out when it's scared. And I think the Republican Party is scared, and they see the United States as becoming a population of minorities. In the not so distant future, the United States will be a majority of minorities. If you take all the minorities in aggregate, that will be your new majority, not people who look like me. And that terrifies them. Generation Z terrifies them. So you have this demographic shift. You have the emergence of your generation starting to vote, not terribly long ago, and you're coming on the scene, and you tend to vote your material interests like minorities do. Minorities tend to vote, whether black or Latino, they tend to, now minority groups tend to vote their material interests. They tend to vote, their votes tend to sync with working class priorities. Well, I got bad news for the Republican Party. I mean, you can't just bank on the votes of billionaires because there aren't enough of them. So what are you going to do? You need votes. You can't just wait for millionaires and billionaires, what are called the donor class, to vote for you. You need quote unquote, ordinary people to vote for you. Well, how do you do that? Well, racism works. That works. It works like a champ. You can get people to vote against their material interests and vote out of racist fear or contempt or whatever word you want to use. That works. That's not a long-term strategy, though, especially in this country. That's not a long-term strategy, and I think it just spells doom for the Republican Party. I'm not saying this because I have this deep love for the Democratic Party. I don't. I'm glad that they're moving toward a more reasonable, they're moving in a reasonable direction. Okay, Bernie Sanders, he lost. I mean, he didn't end up in the White House, but I think Bernie Sanders had a tremendously successful campaign. I mean, he changed the vocabulary. I remember not so long ago, you couldn't even talk about universal health care. People just laugh in your face. People laughed in my face. You couldn't even talk about it. You couldn't even have a serious, rational conversation about universal health care. That thing that every major developed democracy has. Canada, Australia, Japan, Germany, the list goes on and on. They all have it. We don't. How many people go bankrupt in those countries every year? 0. You know how many go bankrupt here every year? 700,000. Well, it just depends on what your priorities are. Who do you want to vote for? So, I mean, Bernie Sanders was talking about this and, alleviating student debt and so on and so forth. I mean, if the rich get free money, why shouldn't we? Fair is fair, right? That was kind of long-winded, but did it answer your question, Saker? Okay. Yeah.
This is kind of like a two-part question, but the first
I love those.
the first part is like you were talking about how like people innately have a drive to do like the moral thing or like be moral actors, but then seeing today politicians kind of shift away from like the moral stance. And do you think there's an incentive for that other than money that kind of makes it happen? And then along with that, worldwide we're seeing a shift towards the right, like objectively in terms of just like more protectionism, less kind of governmental services, and you can track that in every country, Scandinavian, European, Eastern, and why do you think we see like a shift there that's supposed to be like the more like the position that helps more people?
Yeah, but the first part of your question, you're talking about innatism and then the politicians shifting? Could you hit me again?
Said, like people just are born with an innate sense of morality.
Yeah.
And to help more people, but then we see like our political class represent less and less of the majority of the country, which can be seen as like a not moral decision, or even just warmongers. Those overwhelmingly take up like governmental positions. And so why do you think we see a push for people who aren't moral, who don't represent what people want in these positions of power?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. People like to say that, power corrupts, you know. I don't know if I agree with that. I really don't. I mean, you're telling me that Mitch McConnell went to Washington with good intentions and then he just got corrupted? No, I think he was born that way, and I think he just brought it to Washington with him. The short answer is it's about protection of power and wealth. Your opinions don't matter. The working class opinions don't matter. What matters is wealth and power, and who is advertising, and who. Look at the New York Times. There's an example. Okay. You could safely describe the New York Times as a liberal newspaper. It's roughly somewhere between the Democrats and the true center. Fine. On domestic issues like abortion, environment, gun control, this kind of stuff, immigrants, whatever. Domestic issues, it tends to be roughly centrist. In matters of foreign policy and matters of state, it falls right in line. It falls right in line with the State Department because they want to protect their access. If you write for the New York Times, you can just pick up the phone and you can get an interview with the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the Secretary of State or someone like that. No problem. If you start rocking the boat, those doors are going to close, and they don't want those doors closed. Furthermore, if you look at a print New York, I know you guys don't touch print, but I mean, if you look at a print New York Times, as soon as you open it on page, I think it's 2 and 3, the first gate, the first open, you open the paper, you'll see advertisements for luxury goods. They're usually roughly the same as Gucci and Prada and whatever. You see the same ones every morning. Those companies don't want the boat rocked either. They don't want a bad reputation. They don't want to advertise in a paper that's doing hard-hitting, critical journalism, Let's just call it what it is. They don't want the boat rocked either. So the people that work for the paper don't want the boat rocked. The people that are advertising, that are pouring millions of dollars into the newspaper ad, they don't want the boat rocked. Well, what's that got to do with working class priorities? It doesn't. The linguist and political analyst Noam Chomsky, he raises a very good question. Why is there a business section? How many Americans are involved in actual business? How many Americans work on Wall Street? Why isn't there a labor section of the newspaper? Why is there a business section? Well, that tells you a lot. The newspaper is telling you something. It's telling you what the priorities are, and the priorities are not you. And then the second part of the question.
Why is there a worldwide?
Oh, the rightward drift in Europe, and like you see in Hungary and wherever. Yeah. There's a lot of that in Europe going on right now. There's like this aggressive right-wing, deeply racist, which is not hard. Those two are like peanut butter and jelly. They go together perfectly. You're seeing that a lot in Europe. You see the presence of it, and you see it in France. You're seeing it everywhere, West and East Europe. Is there an answer for that as to why we're seeing that? Why we're seeing it in the United States? Well, like I said, racism, that works. Fear works. The German people are told, they've been told for decades, all these Turks and Muslims are coming in, the Muslims they want Sharia law in France and in England, and, that's not even close to accurate. They don't even know what Sharia law is. When you say Sharia law in this country, you just picture people getting their heads chopped off, and stuff like this. This brutal, tribal, rough justice. But that's not what Sharia is. And the Muslim people that are moving to these countries, they have no interest in turning France into an Islamic state. That's just, they can't even be taken seriously. But it works. It's a way to create fear. And just like it's happening here. You know, the people coming over the south border, you know, from Mexico and Central America, you know, they're coming here, they're going to rape your daughter, take your job, and, you know, mooch off the system. A lot of the people coming over the southern border are fleeing violence. They're refugees seeking asylum. A lot of them are women and children. And if we look at the statistics of people who, like undocumented workers coming from Mexico and Central America, they have relatively low levels of crime. Their point is not to come here and join a gang or start, you know, selling drugs or shooting people. Their priority is to come here, make some money, and send it home. Well, that's a little tough to do if you're in jail or you're running from the cops. They just come here to make a buck and send that buck home. So they have relatively low levels of crime, and they do pay taxes, by the way. So, you know, I would start there. I would start with trying to arouse fear in the population, which unfortunately works. Anybody else?
Yes, I have one.
Where? Yeah. Yeah.
Now, and I appreciate what you said regarding like the difference in discussion that you can have with like someone in this room here versus like with parents or uncles, whatever. Because one thing I do notice like is I imagine they fall in the minority of a lot of those like statistics that you have, but they also tend to make like moral block statements about a lot of those issues.
Say that again. Last part again.
They make like moral statements about those issues.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The moral vocabulary that you referenced.
Yeah.
So do you think like the solution we should be heading towards is like digging, like you could speak like in a rhetorical sense, like digging down to the core similarities that we have in our moral judgments or moral choices, or alternatively, like a lot of things you talk about, like address things in a more explicit material sense? Or do you think there's an overlap between the core similarities that we have in our moral judgments and our material interests?
I think the answer is really simple. And that is, you have to talk to one another. I know that sounds like, come on, there's got to be more to that. There's got to be more to it than that. But that really is it. You have to talk to one another. You have to have a conversation about these things. And don't act like your uncles. Don't start bickering and, you know, this guy's a liberal, this guy's a conservative. Yeah, don't even bother with those words. You don't need to use those words. You don't need to use those words. You really don't. I mean, I really want to drive that point home to everyone in this room. You can dispense with that vocabulary. It's not helpful. And when your uncles are bickering over, you know, across the mashed potatoes, they're using those words. They don't even know what those words mean. They don't. Their definition of liberal is not conservative. And their definition of conservative is not liberal. Those aren't definitions. Those are political philosophy terms, which I explain in my classes, because I want my students to know what they mean. But I mean, that doesn't mean you have to use them. You don't have to use them. So I think it just comes down to dialogue, and comes down to not being afraid of talking about these topics like politics and religion. We talk about politics and religion in my classes. I've been doing it for a decade. I have yet to have someone blow a gasket and lose it and storm out of the room angry. This never happened. We have a rational conversation because I start where you should start, with the public opinion polls. Where's the center actually located? Your uncles don't do that. Your uncles just decide, I watch Fox, he watches CNN, I hate him. You know, and is that a rational way to proceed? No. First of all, I'd just like to make a side note. The news, I don't know what flavor of terrible news you prefer to watch. I recommend all my students turn the television off. You see what I just did? This. I grew up in the late 70s, and this is what we did. It's just like a reflex now. But you guys are like, what's he doing with his hand? Yeah. Turn the TV off. Read your news for a start. And the news is not there to like. It's not. I had a print subscription to the New York Times for God knows how many years. And I would sit between classes here at Lewis and elsewhere, and I'd sit there with my paper, you know, looking like I just stepped out of a time machine, and I'd just reading my paper, and then I'd get students that would come up. Why do you like the New York Times? I said, I don't. And then, boy, I got weird looks. They're like, you don't? Why are you reading it? Because I want to know what's going on in the world. That doesn't mean I love the New York Times. I'm not walking around with a New York Times t-shirt. Like, yay, you know, that's ridiculous, you know. It's not what it's there for. Politicians are not there to like. Oh, I don't like her. I don't like him. I hear that so frequently. And they're not there to like. How many of you in this room know who the president of your bank is? So that looks like zero. Okay, they got your money. And you don't even know who the president of your bank is. Who's the president of JP Morgan Chase? Who's the president of BMO? You don't even know. But you have all this personal emotion to spend on these politicians in Washington, D.C. I don't like her laugh. I don't trust him. I don't like him. He looks. You just judge him by his facial expressions and her laugh? That's a pretty low bar. And you can't even tell me who the president of your bank is, the company that has all your money. I find that a little bewildering, quite frankly. So please don't think that because you're watching a particular news program or you're reading a particular newspaper that you automatically like it. I read the New York Times religiously. I have for decades. I don't like it. Yes, they do some responsible journalism on the domestic end of things. On the foreign side of things, if I didn't have the background that I do in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, I wouldn't even know what the hell they were talking about. Honest to God. The language they use is so cryptic, I don't even know what they're talking about. So I think to myself, if I didn't have the background that I do, and I'd done the research that I had done, you know, for over a decade, I mean, how's the person who's, you know, got a family to feed and, you know, goes to a job, and how are they supposed to learn about what's going on in Israel and Palestine if I can't understand this article? The coverage is dreadful. And CNN and Fox, they're just worse. CNN and Fox are just like, I don't even know if Fox is a news organization anymore. I don't even know what they are. They've become something else. And CNN would have to come, to get better, CNN would have to come up to terrible. That'd be an improvement. If they were terrible, that'd be a step in the right direction. They'd have to come up to terrible. But like I said, turn the TV off. Again, long-winded, but did I cover your question? Okay. I saw a hand over here.
You more or less answered it in your previous questions already. It was just in regards to this effective tactics for constituent base to vote against their own material interest.
Yeah.
Then you incorporated that.
I highly recommend reading the book Let Them Eat Tweets by Hacker and Pearson. They do very careful analysis. They're both political scientists. They do very careful, responsible work, and they wrote a book called Let Them Eat Tweets. And the whole book is about this dilemma about you're catering to the mega rich. So how do you get everybody else to vote for you? You're stuck. You're catering to the rich, but you need votes. So what do? Well, you hit the panic button. Called dog whistle politics. And some of them are using like overt racist language. They're not even bothering with a dog whistle anymore, which is scary. I don't read that book is relatively short and easy to read, and I highly recommend it. They will explain in detail how that works and the deep trouble the Republican Party is in. Anybody else? Don't be shy. Or maybe I said something you don't agree with. I can take it. You can disagree with me. I'm as thick-skinned as a brick house. I can take it. Yeah.
So when I've traveled, I've heard that from people in other countries, they feel like Joe Biden's a wounded animal more than the Republican Party.
You've heard this traveling?
Yeah, just from different people across the world and stuff.
Why do they say that?
They just don't think he's very confident. It's a
Well, that's different.
okay.
That's different. Being incompetent is different than being like a wounded animal. What I mean by that imagery is the Republican Party is when power is in a state of descent and it's losing its grip, then it freaks out. That's what I mean by that. But now we can talk about Biden's presidency, and if he's a good president or not, that's a different conversation. And Joe Biden is really no different than Obama or the Clintons. They're all the ones I mentioned in the talk. They're all Republicans, really. They're what Republicans used to be like in the 70s. That's what they are. People on the far right, they describe Obama as some kind of leftist or socialist, or they say the same thing about the Clintons, about Hillary Clinton, but she's a leftist. And that's just comical. To describe those guys as leftists is a joke. Not to mention that it's just straight up wrong. I draw the diagram in class, in my ethics classes. I tell them, here's where the center is. Here's where the two political parties are, two major political parties. Obama and the Clintons and Biden are nowhere near being leftist. They're nowhere, they aren't even within a mile of being leftist. If they were leftists, they would have been pushing through all kinds of progressive legislation. We might have, and the Clintons kind of made a rough attempt at universal health care. But Obama, he pumped the brakes. He's like, no, let's just do this Affordable Care Act business, which was a Republican policy initiative, by the way. That's why the Republicans hate it so much. It's because it's their idea. All the Democrats did was pick it up, paint it blue, and said, here you go, and then they got it passed. And then it's enjoyed tremendous popular support, and the Republicans have been livid ever since, because that's their backup plan. When you ask a Republican, okay, if you guys want to repeal and replace, you want to replace it with what? Replace the Affordable Care Act with what? Obamacare. Replace it with what? And they always mumble. They mumble into their shoes something about vouchers, and they have nothing to say. That's because Obamacare is their backup plan. It was. That was their backup plan. But Obama took it and ran with it. But it was forged at the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative right-of-center think tank. That's where the Obamacare came from. It was a Republican initiative, policy initiative, that's been tremendously successful. But it was a half step, it was a half measure. They didn't go all in and try to pass universal health care and join the rest of the world. No. We just get, subsidized premiums, and, the insurance companies aren't allowed to turn you down for pre-existing conditions and so on. That's all we got. I mean, it's a step in the right direction, but it's not universal health care. And there are still millions of Americans who don't even have health insurance. A big portion of this country is one broken arm away from being destitute. That's a national disgrace. So to hear these politicians being described as leftists is just, it's a sick joke. Yeah, good. Anybody else? Garcia, yeah.
If CNN, Fox News, and the New York Times are all inaccurate depictions of the Middle East, where do you recommend we get news?
I wouldn't say they're inaccurate. I mean, they're not making stuff up. They just leave a lot of stuff out. So it's by omission that they aren't telling you everything. I mean, it's not sinister. It's not like, it's just that you don't get a complete picture as to what's going on in the Palestinian territories. If Americans were shown in high definition what's going on in the Palestinian West Bank and in Gaza Strip in East Jerusalem, the American people wouldn't stand for it. But the American people have this, the image they receive is very antiseptic. And it's a distortion because of how much they leave out. There's no perfect news source, folks. There isn't. They're all flawed, they all lean, they all have their soft spots, they all do, even the independent ones. There's no perfect news source. So I got bad news for you. You have to sort of take in everything and come to your own conclusions. To be fair to your question, I recommend my students, just to keep it short, I look at The Guardian, I look at the New York Times, and I look at Vox, which is an explainer website. For the Middle East, I might also look at Al Jazeera. It's an Arab news source, which is quite good. Al Jazeera means the island in Arabic. I would look at Al Jazeera. And I think that would give you, I think the Guardian's been doing pretty good work. And then I would still look at the New York Times, even though I'm very critical of it. I would start with those four, But don't think that there's this magical news source out there that's going to deliver the truth in all capital letters. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing. You have to take in a variety of sources, bear in mind how those sources are presenting the information, what their shortcomings are. I watch CNN, but I'm watching it more just to see what CNN's up to. So when I say I watch CNN, I mean it. I'm watching them. I'm like, oh, that's the kind of language they're using. That's interesting. I'm watching them. I'm not really watching it for the news content. I get that elsewhere. But I mean, I watch CNN. I watch CNN because I want to know what they're up to. Fox, I pretty much get it. Though I will tune in occasionally. I'll go on their website and I'll just take a look and see what they're up to. But I'm like, yeah, okay, all right. I get it. Yeah, I don't need a huge dose of Fox to know what they're up to. They've made that very clear. Yeah, that's a good question, Chris. Yeah. Anybody else? You can disagree with me. It's okay. Or something you saw, something you heard, something you hear people say, anything. It doesn't have to pertain to strictly the talk or the book or whatever. I mean, it could be just anything. It could be something you hear all the time that you don't think sounds quite right. And really, that is, listen to your gut, follow your instincts. If something doesn't sound right, and you're like, I don't really know anything about this, but that kind of has sort of a BS quality to it. There's probably a good reason for that. Trust your instincts. You don't have to be an expert on this, that, and the next thing, politics or history or economics. If something doesn't feel right, something your uncle is always saying, and you're like, oh, God, but I don't know. Maybe, I don't know enough either way to know what he's talking about, to disagree with him. Well, that doesn't mean you need to disagree with him right there on the spot at the Thanksgiving table, but store that away, that suspicion, because you're probably right. You're probably right. Then check it out. Go look for an answer. Trust your instincts. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. That's been my experience. I started out that way. I started out like, that can't be true. All these guys are talking about Vietnam, they're talking about the Middle East. I'm like, why does that not sound right? I don't know anything about those topics, but they don't sound right. Well, I was right. They're wrong. So, if you take anything away from this talk, it's that. Just trust your instincts and use your own language. Forget the liberal conservative nonsense. Just use your own words and articulate what you want and what you don't want. That will stand you in good stead. Use your own language, think your own thoughts.